Good evening to everyone. On behalf of Council for Social Development and India International Center, I, Ankita Goyal, welcome you all to the Durgabai Deshmukh Memorial Lecture 2026. This year's lecture, titled A New Consciousness for a Fractured Time, Charting a Path of Genuine Transformation, will be delivered by an eminent economist, Professor Mihir Shah. He is the chair of the Rural Management Program at Shiv Nadar University. I would now request our distinguished dignitaries to kindly join us on the stage. Please welcome Shri Atul Kumar Tiwari sir, Director of CST, Professor K. Srinath Reddy sir, President of CST, Shri K.N. Srivastava sir, Director of IIC, and our esteemed speaker, Professor Mihir Shah. May I now request the luminaries to pay floral tributes to Dr. Durgabai Deshmukh and light the lamp. To formally open the evening, I invite CST Director Shri Atul Kumar Tiwari sir to the podium for the welcome and introduction.
Dr. K. Srinath Reddy, esteemed President of the Council of Social Development, Sri K. Srivastava sir, Director of the India International Center, our truly honored guest and keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Mihir Shah, members of our EC, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Council for Social Development and the India International Center, it is my absolute privilege and joy to extend a most cordial welcome to each and every one of you to the 35th Durgabai Memorial Lecture. Since the year 1992, we have gathered on this very date, 15th of July, to honor the birth anniversary and celebrate the enduring monumental legacy of our visionary founder, Dr. Durgabai Deshmukh. Today is July 15, 2026, and looking out at this room in the presence of the audience, so deeply committed to the intellectual, ethical, and social progress of our nation, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. This annual gathering has become a sanctuary, a dedicated space for rigorous thought deep reflection, and a shared civic purpose. We live in an era that frequently and perhaps too easily measures progress by highly visible metrics. We look at the grand monuments we build, the infrastructure, the sheer scale of physical infrastructure, the velocity of our economic indicators. While these milestones are undeniably important and vital for a developing country, we must also look deeper. As scholars, practitioners, and observers of human history, we recognize a more fundamental, quieter truth, which is the ultimate measure of a nation's greatness lies not in concrete, but silently and resolutely in the depth of its social conscience. When we look back at the crucible of our nation's independence movement, we are constantly reminded of those rare, extraordinary individuals who did not merely witness history unfolding, they quietly and intentionally laid its moral foundations. To think of Dr. Durgabai Deshmukh is to contemplate a life defined by radical empathy and decisive, unshakable action. Long before the phrase social inclusion became a standard staple of academic literature and policy papers, Durgabai lived it every single day. She looked at the margins of our society, at the forgotten, the unlettered, and those systematically pushed to the extreme periphery, and she did not see mere numbers or statistics. She recognized them instead as citizens possessed of inherent dignity and agency, as rightful stakeholders to the destiny of a democratic India. To them, her entire life whispered a simple revolutionary promise: you are the priority. She was, in the truest sense of the word, a quiet storm. She was a champion of unheralded causes, an advocate for invisible lives, and one of the core architects of a more compassionate India. And her remarkable journey beautifully traces the evolution of the modern Indian woman, moving seamlessly from a grassroots activist out in the fields to an institutional titan in the national capital. Durgabai's legacy, however, was not built on a mere sentiments or warm words alone. It was forged through structural power and absolute institutional brilliance. She was a woman of historic firsts, yet she treated titles not as ornaments of personal glory, but purely as instruments of public utility. And her monumental contributions span the very architecture of modern India. As a pioneer of freedom movement and social reform, she established the Andhra Mahila Sabha in Kakinada, setting a permanent blueprint of women's empowerment and adult literacy. She then stood as the sole woman representative from Andhra Pradesh in the Constituent Assembly, ensuring that the foundational document of our republic bore the indelible imprint of gender justice and social equity. Later, she served as the first woman member of the Planning Commission, and there is a wonderful history here. In a room heavily dominated by male economists and politicians, when Prime Minister Nehru spoke passionately of dams, heavy industries, and macroeconomic planning, Durgabai famously confronted him. She looked the Prime Minister straight in the eye and declared that there was absolutely no use talking about social welfare without making hard, concrete budgetary provisions for its institutions. And she won that fight. And of course, this was not the first time she had stood her ground against Mr. Nehru. Decades earlier, in 1923, when during the Kakinada session of the International Congress, a young Durgabai was in charge of the Khadi exhibition, which had a strict entry fee of 2 annas. When Nehru himself arrived, she famously refused to allow him entry because he did not have a ticket, holding the line until the future Prime Minister went and purchased one. That was the unyielding integrity of Durgabai. She was the founding chairperson of Central Social Welfare Board, where she institutionalized state welfare, effectively bridging the gap between the top-down governance and grassroots reality. She established the Andhra Mahila Sabha, transforming countless lives by providing healthcare, education, and vocational training to thousands of women. She established the Venkateshwar College here in Delhi, creating a premier temple of learning in the nation's capital. She founded the Durgabai Deshmukh Hospital, ensuring that quality healthcare was never treated as a luxury for a few, but as a basic human right for all. She laid the foundation of Delhi School of Social Work, and of course, what started as a modest group in 1962 under her guidance eventually grew and became an autonomous body on August 10, 1970, which is the Council for Social Development. As the founder of the CSD, she gave us a very clear, permanent mandate, which is to ensure that the research always remains connected to human dignity and that scholarship directly serves the common good. And ladies and gentlemen, when we step back from the long list of institutions, the most striking and breathtaking aspect of Durgabai's life was her utter, absolute selflessness. She was a brilliant criminal lawyer, a member of the Constituent Assembly, and close confidant of the nation's founder, yet she never aspired for high political offices. Alongside her equally distinguished husband, the former finance minister and RV governor, Sri C.D. Deshmukh, she lived a life of absolute simplicity, plain speaking, and deep spiritual detachment. The couple, they firmly believed that institutions are far more important than individuals, and together as a couple, they poured their personal resources, their daily energy, and their health into building institutions that would outlast them and serve others. It is precisely to keep this sacred flame of inquiry and justice alive that the Council for Social Development invites the most eminent minds of our time to address the nation through these memorial lectures. These are not mere academic exercises. They are a direct, living continuation of Durgabai's living, lifelong quest. The topics discussed in our memory hold up a vital mirror to our contemporary patterns of development, challenging its shortcomings, examining its excesses, and searching for alternative paradigms. Today, as the structural inequalities that Dr. Durgabai fought against have morphed into new multifaceted challenges of ecological sustainability, resource equity, and basic human welfare, it is incredibly fitting that we have Professor Mihir Shah with us to deliver the lecture. Professor Mihir Shah is a thinker and a practitioner in the truest sense. As a distinguished professor of Srinagar University, he stands as a foremost authority on water management and rural livelihoods in our country. We are eager to learn from your insights today, Professor. As we prepare to listen to our distinguished speaker, let's carry forward Durgabai's spirit of rigorous intellectual inquiry, an inquiry that always remains connected to the lived experiences at the grassroots. Once again, I welcome our dignitaries on the dais, our esteemed speaker, and all of you who have joined to honor a legacy of action and engage in conversations that may shape our collective future. Thank you very much.
Moving forward, I would now request Professor Reddy to chair and moderate the session.
Dignitaries on the dais, luminaries in the audience, and all of the friends who have graced this occasion. Thank you very much, Tiwari-ji, for recalling the life and legacy of the legendary founder of CSD, late Srimati Durgabai Deshmukh. Thanks also for briefly profiling the panoramic contributions of Dr. Mihir Shah to public policy in India. Of course, after a great distinguished academic career in many of the stellar institutions in Delhi, he also graced the Planning Commission of India between 2009 and 2014 and made several signal contributions to channeling the water policy of the country. Indeed, his contributions to public policy are truly honored by a number of recognitions that he has received. But today, sir, we are truly honored to have you deliver the lecture, which renews the combined commitment of CSD and IIC to continue on the path lit by Mrs. Deshmukh. Mrs. Deshmukh established CSD to stimulate and steer multidisciplinary research into multi-stakeholder engagement for developing and delivering multi-sectoral solutions which can bridge the glaring gaps in equity that were the bane of even well-intentioned development programs in India. She was especially committed to identifying and addressing the causes of developmental deprivation in vulnerable population groups. Professor Mihir Shah has given voice to that vision as a vibrant and valued public intellectual who has combined immaculate scholarship with immersive leadership in the grassroots movements. Professor Shah has spoken truth to power through incisive critiques of public policy. He has also experienced firsthand the travails of travel on the tortuous terrain of policy making while serving as a member of the Planning Commission of India. He bears witness firsthand to the processes by which public policy is made and unmade and sometimes marred. His lecture today will distill that vast and varied experience. It would be very impolite on my part to comment on today's lecture before it's delivered by the speaker. However, I will draw upon Dr. Shah's published and spoken words in the public domain to promise this distinguished audience a rich feast of reasoned critique and real-world responses to the complex challenges that confront us today. A fractured time, as he poignantly phrases it. Dr. Shah has been one of the few public policy analysts who keep reminding us that we live in a complex milieu where siloed solutions framed on the basis of linear thinking will neither deliver on their promise of equitable and sustainable development nor endure over time. He sharply probes the epistemic process by which knowledge is created, collated, and carried into public policy. He has drawn our attention to the fatal flaw of policy making, that is, where the principal stakeholders in the community are neither engaged in contributing their experiential wisdom and tacit knowledge in the problem diagnostic, nor are they earnestly invited to partner meaningfully in the design, delivery, and evaluation of programs proposed to resolve those wicked problems, which bedevil the development process. In fact, it's very clear that community engagement cannot be a condescending gesture of charity, but should be recognized as a strategic investment for the success of all development programs. But epistemic indifference leads to epistemic imbalance that translates to epistemic injustice. We hope to hear more from Dr. Shah on that. In such closeted confines of public policy development, it is not surprising that vested interests of political muscle power and corporate money power have an overwhelming influence, distorting the planned path of development and divesting the fruits of development from those in need to those with greed. We live in a world where many complex adaptive systems, from health to environment, and from food systems to financial markets, connect with each other to coalesce or collide. Dr. Shah has been reminding us that linear thinking is off the mark in addressing emergent problems which arise from these complex interactions. Our path to enlightened societal development has been impeded by technocratic insularity from social realities and bureaucratic indifference to social justice. As public policy gets misdirected as a result, we wait for Dr. Shah to catalyze collective efforts for course correction through this lecture. Before I invite Dr. Shah to deliver the lecture, I would like to thank Professor Rama Baru for proposing Dr. Shah as this year's speaker and persuading him to accept our invitation. Thank you, Professor Baru. Now, I have the immense pleasure of inviting Dr. Mihir Shah to grace the podium and serve as an elixir of erudition and eloquence that will enlighten and energize us towards collective actions. And we hope that he'll be able to guide us to the envisioned path, the path envisioned by Dr. Durgabai Deshmukh, or the destiny envisioned by Dr. Durgabai Deshmukh. As the Nobel Laureate for Literature, Toni Morrison wrote, if we do not create the future, the present extends itself. We cannot afford a passive response. We need an active, assertive response. Dr. Shah, please lead us onto that journey for creating the future we seek. Dr. Shah.
Thank you, Srinath and Atul, for those words, which I don't think I deserve, but I will try my best to deliver an engaging lecture for all of you today. It is indeed a great privilege for me to be delivering a lecture to honor the memory of Durgabai Deshmukh. Durgabai was among the pantheon of legendary freedom fighters and social workers whose stories I grew up listening to from my mother, Vidyaben Shah, throughout my childhood. It is remarkable how closely the careers of Vidyaben and Durgabai resemble each other, both having been freedom fighters and social activists, and both having served as chairpersons of the Central Social Welfare Board. I also feel affinity for Durgabai because, like me, she served on the Planning Commission of India. Of course, she was a member of the very first Planning Commission, and I was a member of the very last one. Indeed, when I looked up the record more carefully, I realized that it has made a mistake in describing me as the youngest ever member of the Planning Commission. This honor actually belongs to Durgabai, who became a member of the very first Planning Commission at the very young age of 41. I am delighted to be second in a list headed by her. What I am here to say to you today would have resonated very deeply with Durgabai, because she was the quintessential champion of the unheralded causes and the invisible people. My own life has been dedicated to both. What I have learned over the past 40 years of my professional life owes most of all to the Adivasis of central India, with whom I lived and worked for more than 3 decades, building the outlines of a new paradigm of development for India and for our time. It is one of the abiding tragedies of India's development experience that nearly 80 years after independence, we still struggle to provide our people the most important needs of life: water, nutrition, health, education, and employment. Often, people like us place the blame for this on the policy it adopted after the era of economic reform started in the 1990s. But it needs reminding that one of the huge weaknesses of the Nehru-Indira era was the terrible neglect of these issues. So whether it was a time when the state was in charge of the commanding heights of the economy, Lenin's phrase much beloved of Nehru, or when the economy was more and more handed over to the corporates after the 1990s, the most important needs of the Indian people continue to suffer monumental neglect. India still spends globally among the lowest proportion of GDP on health, so that out-of-pocket health expenditure remains the single most important cause of families sinking into poverty. The abysmal quality of primary education is attested to year after year by the Asar reports. Even as India claims a place among the fastest growing and largest economies in the world, the single most important issue angering our youth remains the unacceptably high rates of unemployment. The social discrimination and historical injustice suffered by our women, Dalits, and Adivasis continues to be a record no Indian can be proud of. And all of this has remained the case for the past 8 decades, quite irrespective of the dispensation in power. A major reason underlying these failures is the very nature of these problems, which defies magic bullet solutions like government control or privatization. These are what the science of public policy likes to call wicked problems. Wicked problems have a very specific character. They necessarily require a transdisciplinary approach and multi-stakeholder engagement. They cannot be solved without the active engagement of the primary stakeholders, who are our most disadvantaged and marginalized communities. Wicked problems remind us that democracy and development need to necessarily go hand in hand. Without strengthening democracy at the grassroots, development will always remain excluding and even destructive. We know this clearly from the fact that education, nutrition, and health outcomes are superior in regions of India, such as the South, where community engagement, especially that of women, is much stronger. We need to actively adopt the principle of subsidiarity, which posits that solutions must be found closest to where the problems exist. Of course, we must not romanticize this principle to mean that in all situations, local communities are competent and best able to solve their problems on their own. For one, there are internal divisions among most communities in India along the axes of class, caste, gender, and ethnicity. What is more, the state has a vital and unavoidable role to play, however much Gandhi would have had us believe otherwise. Thus, the state must make massive investments to ensure that everyone receives the best healthcare and education. As Vidyaben Shah wrote to Finance Minister Manmohan Singh as he embarked on the economic reforms of the 1990s, and I quote, "What the private sector will not do, what the market cannot do, the state must," unquote. At the same time, mere expenditures without engagement of local communities has led to what I described in the 12th five-year plan as the U without Q syndrome, or universalization without quality. This syndrome in India's more recent development history has been found to be much prevalent where there has been a much needed focus on universal human rights, but not the same emphasis on quality outcomes. The one wicked problem I would like to dwell on a little deeper is water, which is India's gravest but least attended to crisis. Ever since independence, India has relied on the construction of large dams and relentless extraction of groundwater to meet our water needs. Sadly, this has been done with a single-minded intent of establishing a mastery over nature. This command and control approach, which my friend Marguerite Zwatavine has aptly described as masculinities in water, was never a good idea, but is totally unsuited for an era of climate change. This seeking of narrow engineering solutions completely forgets that wicked problems necessarily demand a transdisciplinary approach. If you look at any water resource department in India, whether the center or in the states, you will only find civil engineers and a few hydrogeologists. But how will we ever save our rivers if we do not learn from the science of river ecology? Since agriculture takes up nearly 90% of our water, we must realize that without an agronomic understanding of the need to diversify our cropping patterns in line with agroecology, we will never be able to reduce the humongous demands we are placing on our limited water resources. How will we ever save our rivers and dams if we do not protect their catchment areas and compensate the Adivasis and hill dwellers who protect them? For this, we need to be informed by the insights of ecological economics. And finally, most importantly, we can never manage our surface and groundwater effectively without adopting a participatory management approach led by the primary stakeholders of water, our farmers. Water also helps us understand another key abiding failure of Indian planning, which has outlasted the abolition of the Planning Commission: thinking and acting in silos. As I said in the 12th five-year plan chapter on water, the left hand of drinking water does not know what the right hand of irrigation is doing. This is the main reason why we are still far from providing basic drinking water security to the Indian people. What typically happens is that the aquifer that was providing drinking water to the village is also tapped into by rich farmers growing water-intensive crops. Since the requirements of irrigation are a huge multiple of the needs of drinking water, the hand pump soon runs out of water. This hydroschizophrenia is also the main reason why most peninsular rivers of India are beginning to dry up. Since the water flows in these rivers after the monsoon are sustained by base flows of groundwater, as we drill deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth, these base flows are exhausted and gaining rivers are converted into losing rivers till the point where both aquifers and rivers empty out. Now, in trying to better understand how to forge a new path for development in India, I would draw your attention to some incredibly powerful but relatively neglected work that the Singapore-born political scientist Yuan Ang has been doing at Johns Hopkins University on the Chinese development experience. As Ang says, we must recognize certain defining elements of any process of transformation: interdependence, uncertainty, adaptation, learning, and influence. This is very close to the themes I have been focused on for the past 2 decades since my 2000 paper, The Power of Uncertainty. Based on my reflections and the experience of formulating the 12th five-year plan, as also while chairing the committee to draft the National Water Policy, let me now summarize the key elements of the approach that would help us avoid the mistakes of the past and move towards transformative change in India. In so doing, we will build a novel relationship with both society and with nature, recognizing intricate interrelationships between the two. The new social compact must include at least 4 elements. First, rejection of any kind of fundamentalism. We must reject the notion of a single truth or the correct path. What saves science from degenerating into a dogma is the acknowledgement of the limits of knowing. This liberates us from the tyranny of certainty, whose claim is a part of the arrogance of power and the aspiration for which leads to a suppression of dissent, inquiry, and the sense of wonder and mystery that has to be the beginning of all science and all action. This calls for an acknowledgement that truth resides in a multi-point matrix, not in any one location, that it flows from multiple directions and is embodied in relationships. Second, the criticality of dialogue. An economist whose work has failed to receive the kind of attention it deserves is GLS Shackle. In his incredibly insightful 1972 work, Epistemics and Economics, Shackle argues that since the ultimate permissive condition of knowledge is a repetition of recognizable configurations, this limits the possibility of knowing the courses of action that will be chosen in future. Shackle takes economics into novel territory, such as the role of imagination. But the very freedom that is the basis for imagination makes perfect knowledge an impossibility. Shackle therefore posits a fundamental hiatus between freedom and knowledge, as also between time and reason. Shackle writes, and I quote, "Time is a denial of the omnipotence of reason. Time divides the entirety of things into that part about which we can reason and that part about which we cannot. Yet the part about which we cannot reason has a bearing on the meaning of the part that is amenable to reason. The analyst is obliged to practice, in effect, a denial of the nature of time. For we can reason only about that which is in effect complete, and in a world where there is time, nothing is ever complete." This acknowledgement of our finitude opens up the possibility that we also look to other sources in our quest for knowledge. This necessitates deep listening and the building of common ground across differences, respecting a diversity of approaches and standpoints. Dialogue is a corrective to the stridency of both the bottom-up activist and the top-down planner. Neither by itself is appropriate or adequate. What matters, what enlightens, is deep dialogue, from which something quite unanticipatable, something novel emerges and guides action. Third, fusion of horizons. I want to refer all of you to the extraordinary German philosopher Hans Georg Gadamer and to his magisterial work, Truth and Method, which is often described as one of 2 or 3 key philosophical texts of the 20th century. Gadamer's goal in Truth and Method was to understand what happens to us over and above our wanting and doing. For Gadamer, understanding is always a fusion of horizons. And I quote, "What do we mean by placing ourselves in a situation? Certainly not just disregarding ourselves. That is necessary, of course, in that we must imagine the other situation. But into this other situation, we must also bring ourselves. This always involves the attainment of a higher universality that overcomes not only our own particularity, but also that of the other. To acquire a horizon means that one learns to look beyond what is close at hand, not in order to look away from it, but to see it better within a larger whole and in truer proportion. Understanding is always a fusion of horizons which we imagine to exist by themselves." Unquote. Our knowledge thereby loses the dogmatism of its own voice by acknowledging the need to listen to and understand the knowledge produced by the other, such as India's Adivasis, whose situation we may be trying to transform. Fourth, inside-outside positionality. I agree with the Franciscan friar Richard Rohr that transformational change comes only from those who live on the edge of the inside, which is where you have learned the rules well enough to know how to break the rules properly, which is not really to break them at all, but to find their true purpose. Thus, we are not content to be mere critics from the outside, but strive to be those who can bring about real change through constructive critical engagement with those in power. As Rohr further says, and I quote, "Not an outsider throwing rocks, nor a comfortable insider who defends the status quo, but one who lives precariously with two perspectives held tightly together, the faithful insider and the critical outsider at the same time." Unquote. The approach I am calling for must also reflect a new understanding of nature, which includes at least 3 key elements. First, weaving our interventions into the contours of nature. Rather than making an attempt to control nature, we move towards a creative weaving of our interventions into the flows and dynamics of natural processes. A great example of this is the attempt being made all over the world to foster an ecosystem approach to farming with higher sustainability and resilience, lower costs of production, as also economy in water use. This is the movement away from chemical farming towards a paradigm of agroecology. As Kate Brown, MIT Professor of Science, Technology and Society, says, within the uniform predictability of modern agriculture, the unpredictable emerges. We inhabit not the earth, but the atmosphere, a sea of life. As swimmers in this sea, we cannot be biologically isolated. Biologists have begun questioning the idea that each tree is an individual. It might be more accurately understood as a node in a network of underworld exchanges between fungi, roots, bacteria, lichen, insects, and other plants. The network is so intricate that it's difficult to say where one organism ends and the other begins. This necessitates a paradigm shift in our structures of thought and action to grasp complex adaptive systems where the complexity of the behavior of the whole system cannot be completely grasped by an understanding of its individual parts. Second, respecting interdependence in nature. There is nothing perhaps that illustrates the perils of ignoring interconnectedness in nature than the water cycle. Sadly, water policies and programs all over the world throughout the 20th century were formulated ignoring the profound interconnections of different elements of the water cycle. A potentially catastrophic illustration of this is the plan to link India's Himalayan rivers with peninsular rivers for interbasin transfer of water, which is estimated to cost rupees 11 lakh crore. Not only does this plan have unimaginable ecological and energy costs, the scheme could have a disastrous impact on the very integrity of India's monsoon cycle. The presence of a low salinity layer of water is a reason for maintenance of high sea surface temperature in the Bay of Bengal, which contributes to low pressure areas and the intensification of monsoon activity. Rainfall over much of the subcontinent is controlled by this layer of low salinity water, which arises because the fresh water of India's rivers flows into the sea. A disruption in these flows, and as a result in this low salinity layer, could have serious long-term consequences for climate and rainfall in the subcontinent, endangering the lives and livelihoods of a vast population. Third, location-specific interventions reflecting every element of diversity, social, cultural, and physical. Across India, we are faced with multifarious variations in rainfall, soil and rock type, slope and contour, animal forms, and kinds of vegetation, crop or forest. And this natural diversity has a complex interplay with the social, cultural tapestry of these regions. This includes values regarding life goals, priorities, understanding of and relationship with natural forces and resources, which have evolved over centuries, if not millennia. This canvas of differentia specifica poses a unique challenge. Our interventions cannot attempt a mastery over nature and society. With mastery and control comes the resort to simple tech fixes, monocultural, unilinear, indiscriminate. An insensitive bureaucracy seeks to impose its own pet solution: tube wells, eucalyptus, soybean, Holstein Friesian. Appropriateness does not matter, sustainability of no concern, dialogue is not attempted, history is given a go-by, with disastrous consequences. Learning from each of these cautionary tales, as it were, I tried to forge a very different pathway to policy making when I got the opportunity, both when I was member planning commission and when I chaired the committee to draft the national water policy. By the early 21st century, it had become evident to all scholars and practitioners on water that a big change was needed. But there were major vested interests blocking the way forward. There was a whole political economy of corruption around water, and those who had enjoyed its fruits were not inclined to change or allow change to happen. New ideas needed to be put into place, for which the best scholars and practitioners had to come together. This required a new architecture of plan formulation. I insisted that the working groups with the 12th plan in the water sector, for the first time in the history of the Planning Commission, be all chaired by renowned experts from outside government. These included giants like Himanshu Kulkarni, Sunita Narayan, A. Vaidyanathan, Tushar Shah, Joe Madai, and Nirmal Sen Gupta. Secretaries of concerned departments were designated co-chairs. Members of the working groups were the best scholars and practitioners on water and represented the full diversity of concerned stakeholders. This was not mere tokenistic consultation. The government was not just speaking to stakeholders. The members of the working groups were actually drafting the 12th five-year plan. They were writing programs and policies. This had never happened before. The process of hammering out agreement on change was deeply inclusive, and the most important part was that it had buy-in from the key implementers, the state governments. The most innovative ideas sketched out in the 12th plan were all based on best practice from the states. There was initially great resistance to this move, both within and outside government. Within government, secretaries of the concerned ministries protested to the Prime Minister, saying it had never happened before that they were not sharing the working groups. But the Prime Minister strongly stood by them. Among civil society members, there was great reluctance to work with those they had been so critical of all these years. There was unwillingness to give up long-held positions, as also the not uncommon rift within civil society, often a consequence of huge personal egos. It was my role to gently impress upon everyone that only their working together could provide the solutions the country so urgently needed, given the crisis that they all acknowledged, and that they needed to arrive at a workable consensus on each issue, even where there were major disagreements. Over the course of several months in 2011-12, a new path was charted out, giving rise to a 10-fold paradigm shift in water management and governance in India. For me, the clear sign of success was that the outcome left all sides unhappy. I was happy because each one had shed their pet fundamentalisms. We adopted a very similar, deeply consultative process while drafting the new national water policy in 2019-20. Once again, the process was highly contentious, with older members of the water establishment strongly resisting the radical proposals for change. But we got solid support from the younger members of the Central Water Commission, who were keen to become part of a thoroughly revamped world-class organization, as also from the states who are thirsting for reform. The committee to draft the new national water policy held 16 meetings over a period of 1 year. It heard and received 124 submissions by experts, academics, practitioners, and stakeholders. This included submissions by governments of 21 states and 5 union territories, and 35 presentations and submissions by departments and ministries of the Government of India. The new national water policy was based on a national consensus that was evident from all the inputs received by the committee. What these experiences with policy making at the highest echelons of government taught me is that unless the voice of the voiceless, invisible people is mobilized, their interests will continue to be ignored and even harmed by the powers that be. But I learned something even more important, something that is not paid equal attention to, which is that without a transformed consciousness, it is difficult to imagine the possibility of a new development paradigm that not just India, but the whole world requires. So long as human beings continue to believe that their happiness lies in competitively seeking more and more material prosperity and greater command and control over nature, it would remain impossible for humanity to look beyond capitalism. After all, capitalism has proved to be the most efficient economic machine to deliver goals based on human acquisitiveness, unbridled competitiveness, and greed. If these fundamental aspirations of people are not altered, if they continue to seek endless joy in external sources, then their suffering and that of the planet cannot be ended. I derive my inspiration here from a long and unbroken chain of social and political activists, including Gandhi, Ambedkar, Paulo Freire, Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, and bell hooks, who centered their attempts at social transformation around a spiritual understanding of the world. They brought to bear reconstructed spiritual resources to address what they saw as the key challenges of their own time and context. Their work shows that without the inner transformation proposed by the science of spirituality, it would prove impossible to build a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. I would go further and argue that the insights of this science are essential for the very survival of the planet in this era of the Anthropocene. From this pantheon of spiritual political activists, I will share with you today the insights of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, the political radicalism of whose spirituality I had occasion to study in some depth while delivering the commencement lecture at the Ambedkar University, Delhi in 2018. Ambedkar's spirituality did not allow for a crude separation of the personal and the political. For in his vision, one was well and truly embedded in the other, which each defining and redefining the other. To put it simply, for Ambedkar, the challenge of social transformation was inextricably bound to the task of inner transformation. One could not happen without the other. Meaningful politics in an unjust society comprises any endeavor to alter the balance of power in favor of the deprived and the oppressed. How radical such an attempt is turns on how comprehensive a challenge is mounted to structures of power and how enduring is the vision of transformation embedded in this politics. Do we get to experience freedom at the deepest level, or do we continue to remain caught in the endless cycle of desire, fulfillment, and lack that becomes an eternal source of bondage and unfreedom, more overpowering than any external servitude? It is these questions that drew Ambedkar to the various religious traditions and finally to Buddhism. As early as 1936, while making a blistering attack on the caste system in his classic work, Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar asserted, "I believe that true religion is the foundation of society, the basis on which all civil government rests." Lest there be any misunderstanding, let me hasten to clarify that Ambedkar is not here making a case for a theocratic state. His emphasis is on the fostering of values that would engender a humane society. The question he asked himself was, what would foster a society imbued with these values? And his clear answer was that this requires a process of inner transformation without which all activism and all social engineering would come to nothing. He was drawn to the religious traditions because the change they seek is more fundamental than the one sought by what one may call the more sectarian movements, each undoubtedly invaluable and extremely challenging in themselves, but finally limited to transforming a specific structure of power, whether based on gender, class, caste, race, region, or community. This also helps us understand Ambedkar's rejection of Marxism and what makes his spirituality so powerfully radical in political terms. Ambedkar's was a ceaseless struggle to arrive at a body of thought that would enable liberation from the world of sorrow, not only for the Dalits, but for all beings on earth. He was drawn to both Marx and the Buddha, but he contrasted the means advocated by them. And I quote, "The means of bringing about communism, which the Buddha propounded, were quite definite. The Panchashilas, which address that part of the unhappiness of man that results from his own misconduct. The Noble Eightfold Path, which addresses that part of the misery which was the result of man's iniquity towards man. And the doctrine of Nibbana, which outlines the asavas or hindrances in the way of the Eightfold Path. The main hindrance is the delusion of self. So long as a man is wholly occupied with himself, chasing after every bauble that he vainly thinks will satisfy the cravings of his heart, there is no noble path for him. Only when his eyes have opened to the fact that he is but a tiny part of a measureless whole, only when he begins to realize how impermanent a thing is his temporary individuality, can he even enter upon this narrow path. For this, we need the paramitas, the virtues to be practiced in one's daily life. The first is khanti, or forbearance, the essence of which is not to meet hatred by hatred. As if speaking directly to us in these hate-filled times, Ambedkar says, "For hatred is not appeased by hatred, it is appeased only by forbearance." Having clearly explained the path of the Buddha, Ambedkar goes on to ask, and I quote, We must now consider whose means are more lasting. One has to choose between government by force and government by moral disposition. And he argues, the Buddha's way was not to force people to do what they did not like to do, even though it was good for them. His way was to alter the disposition of men so that they would do voluntarily what they would not otherwise want to do. Society has been aiming to lay a new foundation, which was summarized by the French Revolution in 3 words: fraternity, liberty, and equality. But the French Revolution failed to produce equality. We welcome the Russian Revolution because it aims to produce equality, but it cannot be too much emphasized that in producing equality, society cannot afford to sacrifice fraternity or liberty. Equality will be of no value without fraternity or liberty. It seems the 3 can coexist only if one follows the way of the Buddha. Communism can give us one, but not all. Unquote. At the same time, Ambedkar develops a powerful critique of capitalism, and I quote, there are 2 forces prevalent in society, individualism and fraternity. Individualism is ever present. Every individual is ever asking, I and my neighbors, are we all brothers? Are we even 50th cousins? Am I their keeper? Why should I do right to them? Fraternity is a force of opposite character. It consists in a sentiment which leads an individual to identify himself with the good of others, whereby the good of others becomes to him a thing naturally and necessarily to be attended to, like any of the physical conditions of our existence. Individualism would only produce anarchy. It is only fraternity which prevents it and helps to sustain the moral order among men. Of this, there can be no doubt. Unquote. Since we are speaking of religion, I would like to make one thing absolutely clear. The degeneration of religious traditions has happened to each one of them without exception. This has very much to do with the unholy alliance that has emerged historically between institutionalized religion and the structures of power in society, which is why a lot of mainstream religious discourse has tended to propose an acceptance of the status quo, or has been conveniently interpreted as doing so by the powers that be in order to buttress their power. This is truly ironic because the founders of these religious traditions were all social revolutionaries of their day, advocating the overthrow of oppressive systems of power. The Franciscan friar Richard Rohr explains this paradox, and I quote, as long as Jesus' followers were on the bottom and edge of empire, as long as they shared the rejected and betrayed status of Jesus, they could grasp his teaching more readily. Values like non-participation in war, simple living, inclusivity, and love of enemies could be more easily understood when Christians were gathering secretly in the catacombs, when their faith was untouched by empire, rationalization, and compromise. In CE 313, Constantine legalized Christianity. It became the official religion of the Roman Empire in CE 380. After this structural change, Christianity increasingly accepted and even defended the dominant social order. The church slowly lost its free and alternative vantage point. When the Christian church became the established religion of empire, it started reading the gospel from the position of maintaining power and social order instead of experiencing the profound power of powerlessness that Jesus revealed. Unquote. Something very similar can be traced in the history of all major religions, which have tended to lose track of their true spirit. As Sri Aurobindo describes it, society has historically used religion, and I quote, to give an august, awful, and would-be eternal sanction to its mass of customs and institutions. It made of them a veil of mystery against human questioning and a shield of darkness against the innovator. It laid hands upon it at once to mechanize it, to catch the human soul and bind it on the wheels of a socio-religious machinery, to impose on it in the place of spiritual freedom an imperious yoke and an iron prison. It saddled upon the religious life a church, a priesthood, and a mass of ceremonies, and set over it a pack of watchdogs under the name of creeds and dogmas which one had to accept and obey under pain of condemnation to eternal hell by an eternal judge beyond. This false socialization of religion has been always the chief cause of its failure to regenerate mankind. Unquote. On the other hand, as Aurobindo further explains, the spiritual core of religion seeks to do exactly the opposite. And I quote, neither in the individual nor in society will it seek to imprison, wall in, repress, impoverish, but to let in the widest air and the highest light. A large liberty will be the law of a spiritual society, and the increase of freedom a sign of the growth of human society towards the possibility of true spiritualization. The challenge, as I see it then, is to acknowledge with clear and open sight exactly what went wrong with religion, but recognize and recover what is invaluable in each of these spiritual traditions. The most powerful statement of this perspective is by Swami Vivekananda in his lecture in California in the year 1900. And I quote, I accept all religions that were in the past and worship God with every one of them in whatever form they worship. I shall go to the mosque of the Muslim. I shall enter the Christian church and kneel before the crucifix. I shall enter the Buddhistic temple where I shall take refuge in Buddha and his law. I shall go into the forest and sit down in meditation with the Hindu. Not only shall I do all these, but I shall keep my heart open for all that may come in the future. Is God's book finished? Or is it still a continuous revelation going on? The Bible, the Vedas, the Quran, and all other sacred books are but so many pages, and an infinite number of pages remain yet to be unfolded. I would leave my heart open for all of them. Unquote. It is in this spirit that we must approach the various religious traditions which are based on repeated and creative experimentation carried out over thousands of years. Their aim is to provide a pathway towards personal transformation that helps build the inner strength, courage, and poise which enable us to negotiate what the Bhagavad Gita has called this abode of transience and sorrow, dukhalayam ashashvatam. What the Buddha and the Lok Vipatti Sutta describes as the vicissitudes of life, loss and gain, disrepute and fame, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. Adopting these practices enables two key transformations without which social transformation cannot be visualized. The first, a transformation in our aspirations so that we can get off the capitalist treadmill of endless desire. And second, a building of the inner strength that the arduous task of social transformation requires to face the horrors of the world outside. To be able, in the words of the Islamic scholar Hamza Yusuf, to walk the earth with the dignity of a lion, strong, unfazed, unprovoked, and unperturbed by what life throws at us. There is a rich diversity of practices across multiple spiritual traditions, ranging from meditation, breathing techniques, mantras, rituals, prayers, and Quran study to martial arts. The list is quite endless, really. Each tradition invites us to experiment with these practices, and then through our own experience of their effectiveness for inner transformation and building inner strength, we can decide whether to accept or reject them. As Vivekananda says, our business is to verify, not to swallow. Religion, like other sciences, requires verification by everyone. Unquote. The only requirement, of course, is that we remain open to the possibility of discovering the truth on this path, and we don't reject it without even giving it a try. For we must always acknowledge that the intransigence of atheism can be as virulent as the obduracy of religious fanaticism. I would now like to conclude this lecture with some final remarks. When we examine the dominant values that have animated society in the 20th and 21st century, we find Ayn Rand's virtue of selfishness, imposition of sameness in both McDonaldized global capitalism and in the totalitarian states, intensifying hatred for excluded minorities, the strident assertiveness of certainty of knowledge, and the dominion over nature which spans both left and the right. The consequences of these are also vividly before us. The continual crisis afflicting global capitalism, a planet in serious danger, has also growing inequality and violence within society. Challenges to capitalism from the left have sadly met exactly the fate that Ambedkar described and anticipated. The vacuum is increasingly filled by forces of hatred from the right. Surely the time is ripe for a serious reconsideration of the way forward. The organic link between inner transformation of the individual and larger social change postulated by Ambedkar is invariably missing in our politics. As a result, we view conflict as an arena of our victory over the other. A conflict needs not so much a victory as a resolution. Indeed, a defeat that moves society forward on the moral landscape, that empowers the disadvantaged and sensitizes those in power, deepening democracy in the process, could even be preferred to a victory that fails to achieve any of these. A key to moving forward in this direction is to give up the antediluvian, unitary, and insurrectionist conception of revolution with a capital R. The unique appeal of scientific socialism was its claim to have discovered the law of motion of modern society that definitively predicted the inexorable coming of a new dawn. As Ambedkar argued, this teleology has ended up becoming the chief weakness of Marxism. If change is visualized in these terms, means ends dilemmas will be run roughshod over, and horrors of the Stalinist kind will continue to be perpetrated. The champions of technology, the free market, and the totalitarian state each peddled their own fundamentalisms throughout the 20th century. Instead of the Shangri-La they promised, each one of them, in their own ways, have pushed the planet perilously close to annihilation. Our challenge is not to allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the undeniable darknesses of our time, but to seize the light that still shines within. The science of spirituality offers an alternative path of humility, restraint, freedom, creativity, and joy. Humanity, in stewardship of the earth, would do well to heed this counsel before it is too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shah, for that sublime exhibition of scholarship, which described with great erudition the dynamics of transformation within individuals and of the society which they collectively occupy and are part of. To provide the reflections on this lecture, now I invite Shri K.N. Srivastavji, who is the director of the India International Center, and also over the last year till Tiwariji joined, was also gracing the chair of gracing the directorship of the Council for Social Development.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. The dignitaries on the dais, ladies and gentlemen. Today we remember Durgabai ji with a lot of respect and reverence on the occasion of her birth anniversary. As has been mentioned by the previous speakers, she has contributed immensely to our country, to our society, in terms of social reforms, in terms of building up versatile institutions, and also serving as a member of Constituent Assembly. We just had a very eloquent talk by Dr. Mihir Shah. It is always a delightful experience to hear him. I had the occasion of hearing him in the past on few occasions, and today's experience was no different than what it was on the other occasions. He has been raising several public issues every time. Today also, he reminded us that even after 8 years of independence, still we are not able to solve the problem of water, nutrition, health, education, and employment which our people have been facing. He says very nicely and very correctly that democracy and development have to go hand in hand. one cannot be really separated from the other. He called for genuine transformation. All these issues that he has raised definitely should make us to sit up, ponder over them, and start working for the larger good of our own people. He emphasized on investments on education and health. If you recall the traumatic phase of COVID-19 pandemic, it has only given us a wake-up call saying that unless you care for the public health, your individual health is of no consequence. Similarly, if you do not take care of the masses as such, in terms of investing in education and health for them, looking after the overall welfare, your individual welfare is of no significance. It is. We have been seeing that of late, the governments, though they have been talking of education and health, but year after year, the investments in these two sectors are declining. I remember I am born in a village, educated in my village, school education, primary education, all I got my village. But the quality of education used to be so high, it was no inferior to what it was being imparted in urban areas. The teachers were totally competent, they were well paid. But today, when I go over there, I find that all those things are gone. The governments have completely withdrawn, I would say. They have left the plight of the rural students in the hands of private sector, who are really not doing any great service as such. Public universities through which we have got our higher education, they are in decline. The kind of investment that they need, the kind of freedom that they need are just not there. If we do not really take care of these requirements, I do not know what is going to be happening to us in future. I would not like to make a long speech. Only briefly, I would like to say that the issues what Dr. Shah has raised, very important. We have to also now be conscious of our duties towards the nature. Unless we protect the nature is not going to protect to us. Before I end, let me tell you that this year, ISC festival, which we conduct in the month of October, this year we are going to have the festival from 29th October to 2nd November. The theme of the festival is Prakriti, the nature. All the programs are going to be centered around that particular theme. I'm sure many issues what Dr. Shah has raised perhaps will be, addressed somewhere or the other by the program that we're going to conduct. So, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much. And I am really very grateful to Dr. Shah and as Dr. Srinath Reddy said, Rama Baru, who ultimately suggested his name for delivering this beautiful talk. And let us carry the message that is given to us and let us work to our best of ability for the good of our country and our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srivastava ji, and